Hello, my name is Justin Sotelo, and I will be talking to you about high dynamic range, or HDR photography. Basically, we'll talk about what that means, how you capture HDR images in camera, and then subsequently I'll be doing a separate video that discusses how we actually process those images. Okay, so we're essentially creating a series of images in camera, and then we're going to take that series of images and then we're going to merge them in Adobe Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw or Photoshop. Okay, so a couple of examples here of HDR photography. So what's the goal of HDR? What is it? Essentially what we're doing is we're trying to preserve detail in the deepest shadows of a scene, as well as preserve detail in the brightest highlights of a scene. Okay, when we talk about dynamic range, that essentially just means the range between the lightest tones to the darkest tones within a photo. Okay, so again, we're trying to preserve detail across the board. We're trying to prevent our highlights from clipping or from blowing out or going to pure white, and we're trying to prevent our shadows from, going to pure black. Basically, we're just, losing detail in those two extremes. So how do we do HDR? Basically, we are capturing multiple images of a scene, okay, of the same scene, the same composition, but we're using different exposures, okay, so different shutter speeds essentially to capture a series of images that we will then merge together in the end. Okay, you may also be familiar with the term bracketing. Okay, so that's essentially what that means. We're taking a series of images at different exposures, different shutter speeds. Okay. So ultimately, as I mentioned, we're going to be taking these individual images and merging them together to get a final image that has kind of an overall correct exposure across the board. Okay. At the very minimum, we could do this with 3 shots or 3 images. Okay. We could take one base image, which we could consider correctly exposed, or if our camera is telling us in the exposure level indicator that it is at 0, that in theory is a correctly exposed image. So we can take that first base shot, and then we can take a shot that meters light for the highlights separately, and then lastly we can take a final shot that meters light for the shadows. Okay, so what does that mean? A couple of examples here. So in this first example, the next to last bullet, that is an example of taking 3 individual shots. So the 0 represents kind of your base shot, your quote-unquote correctly exposed shot. However, even though our camera is telling us that the scene is correctly exposed, we might be losing detail in the shadows and in the highlights. So then we will take, in this example, a second shot at -3 exposure value. So essentially that's 3 stops underexposed, okay? And then we'll take a last shot at +3, or 3 stops overexposed, okay? I'm going to show you some examples of this in just a bit. We could also do a series of 5 images, or we could do up to even 7 images if we wanted to. So in this last example, you'd be taking 7 shots. So again, 1 at 0, or kind of your base exposure, and then you could just kind of go across the board, -3, -2, -1, +1, etc. So why do we still use HDR photography? As we all know, our modern cameras and the sensors are getting better and better every year. Many modern cameras now have or they're capable of capturing a dynamic range of anywhere between 12 to 14 stops of light. However, they're still not capable of capturing the dynamic range that the human eye can see, which is estimated to be between 18 and 20 stops of dynamic range. Okay, so again, our goal is to preserve detail in the shadows, detail in the highlights. So what are some examples when HDR might come in handy? as you might have guessed, with landscape photography or cityscape or nightscape, examples of, when we have scenes that have kind of these dark shadows or, these kind of blown out highlights, that sort of thing. That's when HDR comes in handy. Or some of the other examples here, when we have dramatic skies, or maybe we're shooting architecture or interior where, we have really bright lights and really deep shadows, and we're just trying to balance everything out. So these are examples of when we might utilize HDR photography. So here's some examples here with landscape. So as you might imagine, with this image on the left, if we were taking that photograph and we were essentially exposing for these big rocks in the foreground and the shadows, in order to kind of get or see that detail, we're going to have a longer shutter speed. Okay, but what's going to happen with the longer shutter speed is that this sky is going to be blown out. Okay, so in order to kind of overcome that problem, we're going to take a series of shots, okay, at various shutter speeds, various exposures, and then we'll merge all those together to get a more balanced image. Okay, so another example here. A few more landscape examples. Okay, so as you may have experienced before, so if you were shooting a scene like this in Yosemite Valley here, if you were exposing for maybe these mid-tones in the mountains here, you take that first photograph and yeah, maybe that looks good, but your sky might be blown out. Right, so you would subsequently take another shot or another series of shots at a faster shutter speed so that we also capture the detail in the sky or the detail in the clouds. Some examples of architectural photography. Okay, so with this example on the right, as you might imagine, there are some areas there that are dark, or even this area in the middle of the image that goes almost completely black. Okay, and then as we might imagine, these lights here on the ceiling are probably pretty bright. Okay, so our goal here is to kind of balance all of that out so that these lights are not completely blown out where we're losing all the detail there, and that we're also capturing some of this detail in the bricks. Okay, so again, we're taking a series of shots at various exposures, various shutter speeds, and then we're going to merge them all together to kind of preserve detail kind of across that whole range. Okay, a few other examples here. A few cityscape examples. Okay. So again, as you might imagine, if you were exposing, for maybe this area in the foreground, you're trying to see this detail here, that's going to require a longer shutter speed. And as a result of that, these bright lights are going to be blown out. Okay, so again, we're going to be taking a series of shots, merging those together so that we preserve detail across the board. Okay, a couple more examples here. And just some other miscellaneous examples here. So, you might have heard this argument. Some people might say, is HDR still relevant when modern cameras are getting better and better? But I'll again point out that even though they are getting better and better, they're still not capable of capturing the dynamic range that the human eye can see. Okay. So as a result, I think an argument can still be made that, in order to truly create, an HDR image to get, the result we want, that more than likely is going to require multiple exposures or multiple photos that we blend together. You may have also heard this, HDR kind of got a bad rap. It's been around for a little while, became pretty popular 10 plus years ago. But I think it got a bad reputation because at the time, I think it was new and there was new kind of automated software that allowed you essentially to overprocess your photos. Okay, so they looked. If you Google HDR photography, you'll probably find a lot of examples of images that look unrealistic. They might look surreal, fake. These are just terms that, people sometimes use when referring to quote unquote bad HDR, something that looks overcooked, oversaturated. Some other things that happen when you overprocess an HDR image, especially like with a landscape image, it might turn the clouds black. And I'm going to show you some examples here. You might also get some halos around highly contrasted edges, which is also something you get like if you really bump up the clarity slider. You can get something like this, like these kind of unnatural halos around dark edges, or as I mentioned, these black shadows, or I'm sorry, black clouds, or just an overall unrealistic photo. Okay. You might also have seen that your camera, if you have a more modern camera, that it does have the capability to create an HDR image in camera. It's essentially a built-in HDR mode. However, with most cameras in that mode, you're essentially creating images that are in JPEG format. Okay, and as you might know, JPEGs are compressed files, and the adjustments are essentially baked into those JPEG files. So, in order to have more kind of control over our HDR photography, we want to be shooting raw files. Okay, so that we have control over the whole process. We're not letting the camera do all the work automatically. And then, I'm probably going to suggest that you initially take your individual shots manually, just one by one. Some of you may also know that your cameras have an auto exposure bracketing function, or it might be referred to as AEB, okay, where your camera essentially takes a series of shots on its own, right? You set it up, you kind of space out, the range, and then your camera will take those shots consecutively, or you might have to just take them, individually, just one after the other. But they're all essentially giving you the same result, but I would suggest that maybe you do it manually initially, just so you understand the process, and then maybe research or understand how your AEB function works in your camera. You can utilize that as well. So yeah, if you do have the built-in HDR mode, this is an example of what you would see in a Canon camera. Okay, so here I'm showing that I have the HDR mode turned off. But there are some different effects you can get in HDR mode. I would encourage you to just check them out, just if you're curious. But for our purposes, I think shooting everything manually in RAW will give you the best overall result. Okay, so how do we shoot HDR? Okay, so we're going to be finding a scene that requires HDR. Okay, so again, a scene that has deep shadows and bright highlights. I'm going to suggest that you always use a tripod when shooting HDR. So determine your composition, set your camera up on a tripod, make sure it's secure, level, that sort of thing, and then take your series of shots. Okay. I always recommend when using a tripod to utilize your camera's electronic level if your camera has one. But basically, we just want to make sure that our shot is level, so we're not having to correct it in post. Okay, HDR images, they can be captured handheld, but I think you're going to get the best result if you're utilizing a tripod. Okay. When you do process your image in Lightroom or Camera Raw or whatever you happen to use, there will be a feature or a box that you check that allows you, that will basically align your photos. So in theory, I think you can do HDR handheld, but you're gonna have a better result if you're on a tripod. Also, when shooting on a tripod, you're going to be taking a series of shots. Some of those exposures might have a longer shutter speed. So another recommendation is to utilize a remote shutter release if you have one. If you don't, you could utilize your camera's self timer, maybe the 2-second self timer. Basically, the goal is to not be touching your camera or the shutter button while the camera's on the tripod for these longer exposures, because you could potentially get camera shake or a blurry set of images. Okay, so just an example here of what a remote shutter release looks like, or as I mentioned, you could also use your camera's self timer. Okay. A little bit about camera settings. I'm going to recommend that you shoot in manual exposure mode. And again, we want to be shooting in RAW, not JPEG. Because we're on a tripod, we can be utilizing the lowest ISO setting in that situation. So ISO 100, for example. And if you're shooting something like a landscape or a cityscape or something that requires a lot of depth of field, I would recommend setting your aperture to f8, f11, maybe f16. Those kind of mid-range apertures tend to be kind of the sweet spot for most lenses, where your lens is its sharpest. So f8, f11, that sort of thing should be a good place to be. And then with your series of shots, you want to make sure that your aperture stays the same. Okay, you don't want to be changing it throughout your series. Okay, so just lock in your ISO. We're going to be setting our image quality to RAW. We're going to lock in our aperture, and then the only thing that's going to be changing is the shutter speed. Lastly, we also want to lock in, I would recommend your white balance, okay, as opposed to utilizing auto white balance, because if the lighting kind of shifts a bit over the series of your shots, that might cause a color shift with your individual images when you're post-processing. So based on the lighting conditions, whether it's sunny, maybe set your white balance to daylight, or if it's a cloudy day, set your white balance to cloudy, etc. Basically, we're just trying to prevent any sort of color shift over the series of images that you're going to take. Okay, so we've locked in our settings. We're ready to take our initial shot. We're going to utilize our camera's metering system and determine our initial correct exposure. Okay, so we're looking at our exposure level indicator and making sure it is right here in the middle. Okay, that's our camera telling us that this should, in theory, be a properly exposed image. So we take that first shot. Obviously, we're going to focus on what we need to focus on in our image, and then we're going to take that first shot. Next, we're going to take our series of shots, and I'll just, again, we can keep this simple. If we're doing a series of 3 shots, our next 2 shots could be at -3 and +3, okay? So taking our second shot with 3 stops underexposed, and then our last shot 3 stops overexposed, okay? And we achieve that by adjusting our shutter speed accordingly, okay? So we would again be looking at our exposure level indicator, adjusting the shutter speed so that the mark here is at -3, and then for our last shot we change our shutter speed so that we are then at +3, okay? Or if we're doing a series of 5 shots or 7 shots, it would look something like this, okay? So again, we're taking our base shot at 0, or where the camera determines the scene is properly exposed, but then we're going to take subsequent shots, changing our shutter speed, and landing at different spots here on the exposure level indicator, okay? So a series of shots, 3 shots, 5 shots, 7 shots. Okay, so what does that look like? So here's an example. Okay, here on the left, this was my mid-range or properly exposed shot. Okay, you see here that I have my ISO locked in at 100. I'm shooting at f11. That stays the same across the board. ISO doesn't change, f-stop doesn't change. The only thing that's changing is my shutter speed. Okay, so as I metered this scene, my camera was telling me 1/60th of a second would be a correct shutter speed. Okay, but then I intentionally changed my shutter speed to two stops underexposed. So I changed the shutter speed to 1/250th of a second. Okay, again, I'm trying to get to the -2 on the exposure level indicator. And then lastly, I took a shot that was 2 stops overexposed, and that gave me a shutter speed of 1/15th of a second. Okay, so that's what these images look like collectively. Okay, and then I will ultimately be combining them or merging them in Lightroom. I referred to this previously. Alternatively, to shooting your series of images manually, you could utilize your camera's auto exposure bracketing feature if you have that available. So if that's something that interests you, I would suggest that you just get familiar with it in the menu system or with your camera's instruction manual. Okay. And it's going to look something like this if you dive into your menus. And if you do have this feature available in your camera, you can set the number of bracketed shots. Okay, so for this example, you could do a series of 3, 2, 5, or 7. Okay, so I would just set that up. For this example, this is an example of taking 5 shots. Okay, so having the number of bracketed shots set to 5, and then I just determine, where I want those shots to land. Okay, so my base shot is at 0, and in this example, we have one at -2, -1, +1, and +2. Okay. So again, depending on your camera, if you do have this feature, your camera may just take those shots all in one, just kind of sequentially, or you may have to manually take each individual shot, if that makes sense. But again, if you are having to shoot manually, I'm always going to recommend that you use a remote shutter release or your camera's self-timer so that you are not physically touching your camera. Okay. Okay, so that's essentially how you capture HDR image files in your camera. And just going back to this slide, basically you're going to end up with something like this. Okay, if you're taking a series of 5 shots, you're going to have a series of 5 shots that have a greater range of shadows and highlights, a greater tonal range. Okay. Okay, so that covers the front end. Next, I'm going to be talking about how you actually process your HDR files in Camera Raw or in Lightroom, basically just merging them all together into a final file. Okay, thank you for listening.